Let's talk about the complicated history of Star Wars book cover art. This is the video I've always dreamed of making, if by always you mean for at least several years. Star Wars is a franchise based around the screen, yes, but it's also been expanded beyond that, as so much of my channel has been dedicated to talking about. We have infinitely more time with Luke Skywalker off the screen in canon and Legends combined than we do on it, and I think that's cool. A large amount of that time off screen is in Star Wars novels, books. And what do they always say about books? Well, don't judge a book by its cover. But we all know deep down that that's not completely true. Yes, judgment of many things on purely outward appearance is obviously and objectively wrong. But for books specifically, the point of that analogy? Books in the past 100 years often have beautiful covers, and that's what I'm talking about today. Something I'm ridiculously passionate about and really want to talk about altogether, especially considering the fact that I don't think anybody else has ever done something like this yet. And a quick note before we get started is that for this comprehensive history, I'm only counting novels that have unique cover art, or have a credited artist on Wikipedia. So they have to be novels and they have to have unique art. This disqualifies a solid amount of young or beginning reader books that just have assets used in very sparing ways or don't have a credited artist on Wikipedia. But I think this is okay, since those were often not the most influential books and don't fit into a discussion about cover art trends and wider franchise trends as well. Now let's get into it. The history of Star Wars begins in 1976. 1976? But wait, how does that work? The first movie came out in 1977, and the films were not adaptations of books or anything like that. Yes, dear listener, the first Star Wars novel, the novelization of the original film, released in November of 1976, half a year before the original film. And the cover art for this original novelization is just incredible. It's a painting by none other than Ralph McQuarrie, the concept artist whose concept art defined a large chunk of the visual style of the Star Wars universe in the original trilogy, and even helped the original script get greenlit for production. He's our first artist spotlight, as his art is too iconic and important to overlook, even if it didn't grace a lot of book covers. McQuarrie's art is very fitting for the novelization, with an epic scope, gradient background, and stunning mechanical detail. But it must be said that this art more so reflects McQuarrie's concept designs than it does the visuals from the actual film. The book was re-released later with many different covers over the years and in different regions, and that highlights another part of this video going forward. I'm not going to be discussing regional variants or reprints for every book unless they specifically warrant it. If I was talking about every single cover, we'd be here all day. Or at least, longer. 2 years later, McQuarrie returned again for another book, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, written by Alan Dean Foster. Vader returns as a centerpiece of the cover, and this one never fails to stun me. Set after A New Hope and telling the story of a low-budget sequel were Star Wars to have failed at the box office, Splinter was instead a hit that was definitely not hindered by its gorgeous, intriguing cover painting featuring Luke and Leia crouching in front of the menacing silhouette of Vader. Following this, the Han Solo Adventures trilogy began by Brian Daley, with artists Wayne Douglas Barlow, Dean Ellis, and William Schmidt painting the dynamic duo in front of some rather plain backgrounds for Star's End and Revenge, while William Schmidt stuck around for more in the 80s. Overall, the 1970s didn't really feature many Star Wars book covers, but that's to be expected considering the scope of the era. But all of the covers were beautifully painted, with some excellent text design too. Two Star Wars films theatrically released in the 1980s, and both novelizations of these films used official poster art by Roger Castell and Tim Reamer on their covers. But the 1980s also saw the releases of not only William Schmidt's wonderful cover art for Han Solo and the Lost Legacy, but he returned for the 3 covers of L. Neil Smith's Lando Calrissian trilogy. The Mind Harp of Sharu, The Flame Wind of Ocean, and The Star Cave of Thanbaka. Schmidt's art is incredibly iconic and gave each book its own color in a really unique way, his painting style bending the elements of each composition together into a small, tightly packed yet dynamic and fantastical image that left a lot of negative black space on the covers. Notably, Schmidt illustrated the Millennium Falcon toy instead of the film's model, leading to a chunkier presence on these wonderful covers. After the final Lando novel released in 1983, there were no other major Star Wars novel publications of note for this discussion until the fateful return of Star Wars publishing in the 1990s. This is where the Star Wars Expanded Universe really kicks into gear. Everything before this, while important, was just a prelude to what we're going to be discussing now. June 1991. The release of Timothy Zahn's iconic and influential Heir to the Empire, the first book in the landmark Thrawn trilogy, published by Bantam Spectra. This was regarded as the Bantam era. These 3 books have cover art by Tom Jung, with character faces clearly inspired by the movies, but seemingly not directly traced. Key elements of note on these iconic covers is the distinct layout of each, and the wonderful misty nature to all 3, with foggy skies and stars lingering behind each composition. Note the prominent window on The Last Commands cover, calling back to the Emperor's throne room in Episode 6. During this time, Star Wars novels expanded into other age ranges as well, with the Jedi Prince series releasing in 1992 and 3, and this is where our second artist spotlight comes in. These 6 chapter books, chronicling the time immediately following the Battle of Endor, and including Palpatine's nephew and an Imperial leader with 3 eyes named Trioculus, had covers painted by the incredible Drew Struzan. Struzan may just be the most famous artist in this video, with his art having graced movie posters for films such as the Indiana Jones movies, Back to the Future, The Goonies, Blade Runner, and even later than this, the Star Wars Special Edition releases, and even the prequel trilogy. Struzan could capture actor likenesses and light them in such incredible ways. His speckled backgrounds and penchant for galactic swirls and clouds are unparalleled in beauty, and his work will continue to grace Star Wars book covers for years to come. But the Jedi Prince series had some seriously beautiful covers, with The Lost City of the Jedi being my personal favorite of the bunch, with Ken and HC-100 in the foreground, and the gorgeous, swirling, framing fire bringing it all together. The only possible criticism I have of Struzan is that his art sometimes is obviously referencing specific frames from the films. Shortly after The Last Command's release, we saw the releases of Jedi Dawn and The Bounty Hunter, some rather niche choose-your-own-adventure books that were not as widely released. Their cover art by Paul Campion appears very Struzan-like, and has always stuck out to me with how this character's shoulders are integrated into the overall framing on Jedi Dawn. They have some really great detail and color too, with The Bounty Hunter being the first meaningful appearance of Boba Fett on a novel's cover, front and center. During the mid-90s, Drew Struzan was a constant presence, with his absolutely incredible art gracing the covers of The Truce at Bakura, with its prominent handshake and OT Trio's busts on the lower third, The Courtship of Princess Leia's incredible framing, wonderful Isolde presence, and just incredibly unique color palette for a Star Wars cover. Not to mention the alternate cover featuring a wonderfully rendered Rancor. The Crystal Star's gorgeous spiral galaxy framing a powerfully stanced Luke Skywalker, and light beams framing a trooper silhouette in the background. I love how the Crystal Star, the object in the background, lays behind Luke with Struzan's signature backlit hair. Children of the Jedi's wonderfully lens-flared stars, and the magical lingering face of Callista next to Luke's concerned expression, and an incredible crowd lining the book's bottom. The Corellian trilogy's tight yet elaborate compositions, with books like Showdown at Centerpoint balancing so many faces and even the Falcon, all in a limited amount of space with a side-mounted title section. Darksaber with its iconic long laser blasts highlighting the entire cover in a linear way, and intersecting Luke's head in an ominous way, all framed by shadowy royal guards. The Black Fleet Crisis is more square compositions featuring some gorgeous fleet and ship depictions, a uniquely purple cover for Tyrant's Test, and interestingly enough, Struzan referencing a frame of Carrie Fisher from The Blues Brothers, not Star Wars, for the cover of Before the Storm. Struzan's work also appeared beautifully on Shadows of the Empire, with its framing and depiction of Xizor being very memorable, and the color palette beautifully complementing the shadowy and intense yet twilighty lighting on all the characters. The similar New Rebellions covers prominent skull and stormtroopers falling beautifully on the speckled blue backdrop of the cover. This one has always highlighted to me how well Struzan plays with lighting, as I previously mentioned, on Luke's face. The colors incorporated in making this really well-lit portrait are incredible. Planet of Twilight's clouds and completely golden palette over its diamond-shaped layout are just so attractive, making this one definitely my personal favorite Star Wars book cover. Interestingly, the faces of our OT heroes even seem less traced here for some reason. Struzan also did the covers for the second Han Solo trilogy, with the colored outlines benefiting from bits of art overlapping with them, and some absolutely top-notch lighting, with reflections, even a lens flare on the Paradise Snare, and glowing space backgrounds galore, making these books truly feel adventurous in a nostalgic way. Rebel Dawn, in particular, is a nearly perfect cover for a book. Then we have I, Jedi, a more unique one, with Luke's glowing face really feeling like a more mature Jedi Master, and Corran Horn's near silhouette being framed within an arch that gives the cover a great sense of geometry and discovery and incorporates elements of Luke's temples on Yavin. And finally, at the end of the 90s, we got his art on the covers of the Thrawn duology, Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future. These covers are, again, nearly perfect, with incredible galactic mist backgrounds, and awesome framing lines vertically lining the cover's edges. I particularly love the lined sun behind Spectre's Star Wars logo, the visually gorgeous Struzan signature close line work on the eyes on Vision's cover, and Mara Jade's seemingly unique appearance here, not to mention the flames framing Vision overall. For his last major contribution to the golden 90s era of Star Wars publishing, I think Vision of the Future might arguably be Drew Struzan's best work. Whew. Now that we're done with Struzanapalooza, the 90s were also host to many other individual books, and other longer book series like Young and Junior Jedi Knights, and the X-Wing books. Early on, following the Truce at Bakura, the Jedi Academy trilogy began, with our first non-novelization appearance of non-full cover art. These books have cover art by John Alvin, and have interesting layouts with fun, misty backgrounds and harsh shadows on the main characters. Champions of the Force has always been a favorite of mine, with the Star Destroyer and Templetop students making a really striking image that sticks in my mind. Young Jedi Knights began soon after, with art by comics legend Dave Dorman decorating the series' covers. These ones had fun holographic reflective elements to them as young adult novels in the 90s, and twisted, sometimes somewhat awkward human renderings. There's a whole bunch of these, and all of them are really unique, but my favorite of the bunch is probably Jedi Under Siege, with the reflective, exploding Masasi Temple providing a great visual. After that specific book though, the YJK series made an, in my opinion, negative shift towards non-full cover art, with solid colored banners on the tops and bottoms of each book, and the main kids' heads just kind of floating there above a central figure. This fortunately didn't last, however, with the return to form on the fittingly titled Return to Ord Mantell's cover, which has a really great eclipse kind of backlighting the central figures. If there's one thing Dorman can always draw though, it's vehicles and aliens, with the submarine on Crisis at Crystal Reef, and Nola Tarkona on Jedi Bounty immediately coming to mind. These covers do exactly what they should, and certainly capture much imagination, and the earlier and later ones have some great layouts. Darkest Night also comes to mind here, with Loi's centrality being wonderful and Kashyyyk's trees laying over the royal guards making for a fun, colorful visual, all highlighted against a bright yellow sun and background. Lightsabers as well gives a spotlight to Tenel Ka, with a great green, teal, and gold color scheme, and some fun patterns in the background. Dorman would also go on to helm the art for the third Dark Forces video game story adaptation, resulting in some pretty stunning pieces. The first two novellas in this series were done by Dean Williams and Ezra Tucker, both adding so much to these stories' visuals. Then came Junior Jedi Knights, focusing on Jason and Jaina's younger brother Anakin, and his friend Tahiri, and had some incredible, underappreciated covers as well, by Eric J.W. Lee. These clean, almost shiny pieces feel to me like a midpoint between Macquarie's clean polished style and Struzan's wonderful backlighting and fine liney style. Lee's dynamic and detailed work on Lyric's world, the beautifully lit and composed cover for Promises, and the delightfully fun Vader's Fortress, with that facial expression for Anakin always sticking with me. I think these covers get so easily overlooked, but seriously, there are some of the most detailed and creative covers in the entire EU in this series. I mean, which other cover has a young boy slashing into a dark wizard's chest and releasing sparkles and light? Kenobi's Blade is yet another amazing cover from Eric J.W. Lee. During this same mid-90s era, the Yule brothers also made their way into Star Wars, with Stephen Yule's work first appearing on Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and soon after, the similar Tales from Jabba's Palace. Stephen Yule's style was very geometric, with super accurate depictions of sometimes very minor characters from the films, adorning all three of his Tales books. There's a certain smoothness to his art that has always stuck out to me as well, with much gentler lighting and even shading on each of his covers. Meanwhile, the iconic X-Wing series began with Rogue Squadron in 1996, with Paul Yule's unparalleled mechanical art making these pilot-based novels seem so action-packed just based on their covers. Nobody draws ships better than Paul Yule, but his work wasn't just ships. His dynamically lit and framed painted covers communicate so much life and energy to machines. Take the Krytos trap for example, with it looking like a view from a window of a ship in a battle above this orbital station. Speckled explosions particularly captured the original trilogy's special effects aesthetic. Speaking of which, the Bacta War is an incredible piece overall, with Yule's X-Wings being painted beautifully from every angle. Wraith Squadron, Solo Command, and especially Iron Fist bringing it to the next level, with even more distinct lighting, harsher shadows, and some absolutely peak reflections on Iron Fist's cover in particular, with the explosions in the distance, gently reflecting onto the ties flying over them from below, lit by moonlight. This cover will never fail to amaze me. Stephen Yule's work would appear again later on, with his Floating Heads covers of the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy books and their unique color schemes. I've always loved how, as mentioned previously, geometrically Stephen painted Vader on the Mandalorian armor, and Xizor's harshly shadowed mug staring at the reader on Slave Ship will never not be memorable. The last big series in the 90s was the Galaxy of Fear series, Star Wars' answer to the 90s popularity of Goosebumps. Now these books are a real doozy when it comes to cover art. They're junior novels between 100 and 200 pages that tell spooky stories. They were still canon to the wider universe at the time, too. Book 1, Eaten Alive, demonstrates this well, looking a lot like a Goosebumps cover, framing a holographic drawing that moved as the reader shifted the cover. That's right, these books had lenticular covers in some versions. Later books in the series did not have these lenticular covers though, and featured Steve Chorney's really nice illustrations, capturing the spooky horror vibes that these books elicited in some really grand ways. The lenticular covers were only released for books 1, 2, 7, and 9, leaving us with 8 fully illustrated covers that gave us such highlights as Darth Vader fighting Darth Vader, this kinda Art Deco, ghastly cover for Ghost of the Jedi, and angry younger Thrawn, and even some repurposed Macquarie art on the final book's cover. Interestingly, the foreign covers of the lenticular books also had fully illustrated covers that weren't available in the US to my knowledge. Still, as far as I'm aware, all illustrated by Steve Chorney. From there, into the late 90s, Star Wars began to boom again. Trust me, it seems like it was booming throughout the 90s with all of the covers we've discussed so far, but we're only getting started, and getting more and more weird. The prequels are here, and Star Wars was back in full force. And 1999 was the year that it all changed. This year, the final 2 X-Wing books released, and so did the final volume of Bounty Hunter Wars and Tales from the New Republic. Meaning, curiously, every Bantam release this year had a cover by a Yule brother, as Paul painted Tales and X-Wing, while Stephen covered the Bounty Hunter Wars. But during this year, The Phantom Menace and its novelization also released, with these 4 goofy photo covers unfortunately hitting the shelves. The Phantom Menace's release and the onset of digital imagery brought about another name that will come up quite a bit: Cliff Nielsen. Cliff Nielsen first arrived in the galaxy far, far away to cover the Scholastic Jedi Apprentice series of books, and boy, did this man know how to Photoshop. These books documented Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's adventures before Episode 1, and if I didn't even tell you that, you can tell based on their design when they came out. Textures galore, digital overlays, fire, odd proportions, floating faces, and more, all key parts of Nielsen's style, and more so, kind of the style of the whole era. And with 18 books in this series, he was never short on work. I'd like to highlight the Mark of the Crown for its sheer ridiculousness, looking like some sort of bad early 2000s Christian fan art of Jesus and a floating crown, and the incredibly ominous looming Yoda in the background of the captive temple. The Deadly Hunter has always looked a bit awkward to me, and the Call to Vengeance's sweaty Mace Windu face also doesn't look the best. But when Nielsen's style works, it actually surprisingly really does work. I think the Day of Reckoning and the ties that bind are actually really wonderful. The Day of Reckoning in particular is exactly the kind of thing I would have wanted from a Star Wars book cover as a kid, and I think that's saying something. Also, the ties that bind is just really cool, and while it does feel appropriate for the era and a bit dated by today's standards, I still really like it. During Jedi Apprentice's run, though, Jedi Quest, a shockingly similar series, began at Scholastic as well, this time starring Obi-Wan and Anakin, leading into Attack of the Clones, with Hayden Christensen appearing kinda on these book covers before he ever appeared in a movie. These covers by Alicia Buello and David Mattingly leaned really heavily into the era's 3D models, it seems, with books like The Dangerous Games just feeling very dated, and The School of Fear just making me laugh because of the awkward, stilted poses. As hinted towards by my hesitancy to say that Hayden fully appeared on these covers, the actor was actually digitally de-aged for these prequel books, leading to some really fake-looking Haydens in the earlier books, and then more grown-up Anakin appearing on the later covers and appearing more believably. This is also a good place for me to mention Rogue Planet, a book by Greg Bear taking place in this same time period, with a cover by David Stevenson also featuring some rough de-aging on whoever this child is, and some odd design work on that lightsaber compositing. Rogue Planet released in 2000, but Jedi Quest lasted until 2004, and during that time period, something special happened. The New Jedi Order, the most ambitious publishing project in the history of Star Wars until the modern age, began with Vector Prime by R.A. Salvatore in October 1999. This was only a few short months after Episode 1's release, and told the story of an opposite era, with a fully grown-up and married Luke Skywalker leading the titular New Jedi Order, consisting prominently of Han and Leia's kids, Jason, Jaina, and Anakin from earlier books, as they all together fought the deadly invading Yuuzhan Vong, aliens from another galaxy. And fittingly for the era, Cliff Nielsen created Vector Prime's cover, and this startling piece contains some of his signatures that you might just be familiar with already. Textures, floating faces, and fire. Lots of fire. The Yuuzhan Vong face of Nomanor appearing fleshy and bug-like, and something you'll see more of as we go, the artistically aged face of Luke Skywalker. But with 19 books in the series, Nielsen didn't do them all. Maybe my favorite covers in NJO are those of Stackpole's Dark Tide duology, painted by John Harris. These gorgeous, almost impressionist works depict the Yuuzhan Vong threat in such a beautiful way, with Onslaught's cover being up there with my favorites of all time. The colors are wonderful and atmospheric, even against the harsher earlier 2000s framing blocks, and make these books feel unique. They feel massive, without prominent characters on their covers, making the galaxy feel arguably bigger than ever. They depict ships, but not like the X-Wing series. Again, a more impressionist approach, showing us just how otherworldly the Yuuzhan Vong threat is. Following Dark Tide came Rick Barry's interesting illustrations for Lucino's Agents of Chaos. The way Barry draws Han's face has always stuck with me, and really emphasizes his grief and depression following Chewbacca's death. Both books have some really odd backgrounds behind their main figures, though, which feels like it juxtaposes poorly in my opinion. After that, our boy Cliff Nielsen is back with the wildly busy and bright cover of Kathy Tyer's Balance Point, bringing all of his standard artistic elements to the forefront. And then, surprisingly, Therese Nielsen, Cliff's wife, helmed the next duology, Greg Key's Edge of Victory. And wow, these books are gorgeous and very unique. Sure, Luke looks a little awkward, but the fully illustrated backgrounds and twisting art on both just make for some really wonderful covers, again juxtaposed against the early 2000s block formatting of the titles. Not to mention the historic and clear usage of model Shannon McRandall's likeness for Mara Jade in a prominent work for what I believe was the first time. Past that, Cliff once again covered Denning's legendary Star by Star, giving it a gross, fleshy Yuuzhan Vong face front and center. And Stephen D. Anderson handled Dark Journey and Traitor, two books that are as varied in quality as they are ugly. I really don't love Dark Journey, but I do think Traitor is the best Star Wars book ever written, and definitely not because of its cover. I hate to say this and rag on a cover, but the clearly odd CGI faces combined with weird X-Wing schematics that don't really fit with the book just don't do it for me. And I think Dark Journeys is a little worse for it with that awkward Jaina face. But in between these two came Alston's Enemy Lines duology, with some really incredible dynamic art by Dave Seeley from the point of view of Alliance cockpits. Rebel Stand in particular feels like it ages up Han and Leia in a really natural way, and getting Wedge on a cover is always a treat. After that, our buddy Cliff returned yet again for Destiny's Way, with what I think is probably his most crowded and muddy work so far. Clearly digitally assembled Jason, you can see some artifacts in there, along with just so many textures and a huge old Luke in not the best quality. Still, I think the layout has something to it. It's dated and it doesn't look the best by today's standards, but there's something charming about it to me. Then we completely switch it up with the Force Heretic trilogy, and it gets weirder yet with iconic artist John Foster doing all three covers. His dark, gloomy, painted poses strike the imagination in such a way that really resonates with the tone of these books. Hope persisting in a hopeless time. Luke and Mara on Remnant are just so dynamic, and Refugee and Reunion dial that up even more with Jason and Jaina in perilous situations on both. The Nielsen couple, hey, it's me during the editing process. I found out that they got divorced after, so if I'm referring to them as being married currently, that is not true. Also, Therese Nielsen apparently isn't the best person, but I don't know, I just wanted to address it, and thank you, back to the video. Together, then finished off the series with Therese's just as great, and maybe even better, The Final Prophecy painting, and a complete whiplash again towards Cliff's cover for the Unifying Force, with Luke looking startlingly younger, and Shimra appearing very Trollface-esque. The New Jedi Order is a huge series, and I just wasted a ton of time going through the whole thing in order for some reason. To me, it narratively is the peak of Star Wars storytelling, and its covers reflect Star Wars book cover art like no others. In the same series, we get charmingly unique, modern composited covers like that of Balance Point, or even Destiny's Way. But we also get rough ones like the Unifying Force that appear very dated, all compiled together with various art styles of painting and illustration. It's just a real treasure trove of art, of every caliber and many styles. After Rogue Planet, more prequel-era books arrived as well, with Darth Maul Shadowhunter, Cloak of Deception, and The Approaching Storm all having some great Floating Heads Photoshop covers. The first by David Stevenson, and the latter two by totally not confusing Stephen D. Anderson. These covers, looking at it now, are pretty much that era's approximation of Struzan covers. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the iconic floating Luminara head. Anderson returned for the Episode 2 novelization, and continued to use his cleaner yet still Cliff Nielsen looking covers over the next few years, contributing to prequel books with iconically 2000s covers like Jedi Trial, Shatterpoint, Yoda Dark Rendezvous, and The Cestus Deception, which particularly looks very effects heavy, while also helming two later made New Republic titles with Tatooine Ghost and Survivor's Quest, kind of uniting the eras with a similar visual design for parts of the timeline that are so separated. I'd like to highlight these two New Republic era books in particular for using pretty recognizable photos of actors for their covers, something that is quite noticeable but doesn't necessarily detract from their quality, much like the Struzan covers of the decade prior. I will point out this weird live-action Thrawn on Survivor's Quest, and the digital-looking Mara next to photorealistic young Luke who's supposed to be old, though. In 2003 comes one of the highlights of our journey so far, widely regarded as the worst piece of Star Wars book cover art ever made, and I don't even feel bad saying this because there was no artist involved in making it, is Star Wars Galaxy's Ruins of Dantooine. This cover is startlingly bad, simply being a screen cap from the game, I assume, with the game's awkward-looking logo on top and embarrassing fiery text of the book's title laid over the art in a weird way. It just reeks of placeholder, not enough time, or not enough care. I just honestly don't think it can get worse than that. Seriously, this is horrible. Though it is important, as it shows just how bad things can get, and thankfully, how bad they never get again. Also part of the massive Clone Wars multimedia project which was running at the time was the MedStar duology, which saw the return of Dave Seeley from the New Jedi Order Enemy Lines books, this time tackling Barriss Offee and the conflict of the Clone Wars in these underrated and incredible covers. Seeley's detail and dynamism on full display with these two. Leading into the mid-2000s, the Boba Fett Young Reader series released 6 books, all with some more distinct photoshopped-together covers, also using some recognizable promo photos for its characters, all created by artist Peter Bollinger. Note the odd CGI dirge on Hunted's cover, CGI Ventress on Pursuit, and the concept art Grievous on A New Threat, all reflecting the era's design sensibilities pretty well. Approaching 2005 and Revenge of the Sith, though, came more and more edginess. Star Wars was officially going PG-13 with Episode 3, and with it came darkness, shadows, and fire. Just look at Anderson's Labyrinth of Evil, and Episode 3 novelization, and Stevenson's Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, followed by Denning's Dark Nest trilogy with covers once again by Cliff Nielsen. Fire, darkness, bugs, Luke shooting Force lightning from his hands, more photoshopped promo pics, and 3D models. Overall, in between the late 90s and 2000s, Star Wars book cover art was getting more extreme in many ways, enveloping lots of art styles. But one artist I'm going to highlight here is Tsuyoshi Nagano. Nagano is the artist responsible for the Japanese covers of so many Star Wars books, the entire NJO. The Dark Nest trilogy, the Hand of Thrawn duology, The Last of the Jedi, some Clone Wars novels, even Jedi Quest, and more. His style is absolutely incredible. The covers spanning these wide, unique layouts, oftentimes taking inspiration from the original cover art, but improving it with distinct painted stylings. I just cannot get over how incredible Nagano's style is. In many cases, most cases actually, I think I prefer it to the original cover releases. Nagano is just so good at rendering large compositions, with varied colors, stances, and subject matter not affecting just how skillfully done these are. I'll highlight a few favorites, with the gorgeous Outbound Flight cover, with the best aged-down Anakin we've ever seen. Jedi Quest School of Fear, yeah, remember that one? Here's Nagano's cover. What a layout. The Joiner King, its ringed planet in the background, foreground X-Wings, plus a wonderful green hue, aged up Jason and Jaina, all huge improvements over the original in my opinion. And finally, though he did all of the NJO covers and they're all special, we have NJO's Traitor. The lighting here is immaculate. Red fading to blue and all of the purples in between. Heat personified. Aliens beautifully done, and Jason's silhouette prominently standing out. Maybe the coolest No Manor has ever looked. Vergere done so well. Ganner prominent in the composition, of course, and a lingering Anakin face for good emotional measure. To me, Tsuyoshi Nagano will always be remembered as one of the all-time greats to have work grace Star Wars book covers, and I'm glad I was able to talk about him. Also during the 2000s, Karen Traviss started the Republic Commando series, a series with a very interesting set of cover art. Greg Knight provided this art, with what seems to be 3D models arranged, though possibly painted into very gritty situations. The edginess, of course, continues here, with dark images calling to mind the horrors of war, and ending with Imperial Commando in 2009, taking us into the late 2000s and early 2010s in regard to graphic design. Things are getting cleaner and less crowded, and colors more single choice. This is clear in other books that released in this edgy era, like Karpashin's Darth Bane trilogy, with incredible covers by John Jude Palancar for books 1 and 3, but Palancar's art being scrapped for this roughly 3D modeled yet adequately fiery and edgy cover for Rule of Two by John Van Fleet. Although foreign releases of Book 2 actually did use Palancar's art anyway, the switch being an odd decision. Post-Episode 3 also gave us the Last of the Jedi series, one with an interesting case of shifting cover artists. John Van Fleet covered the first 5 books in the series, with his somewhat odd geometric covers for these young reader books featuring the occasional photoshopped face, but fitting the age group and story appropriately. But then, for book 6 and on, Drew Struzan himself returned to Star Wars for this series, giving us some of his best work ever. Totally anachronistic and feeling like the 90s, Struzan was back for more in the mid to late 2000s. More edge can also be seen in Zahn's 2007 Allegiance, also by Van Fleet, but not all covers were edgy during this period. Once again, John Harris from the Dark Tide duology drew a space station, blessing us with this fully painted cover for Death Star, and Dave Seeley gave us the absolutely gorgeous depiction of the outbound flight in 2006. That same year, though, edginess reached its full throttle with Legacy of the Force. Written by Aaron Alston, Karen Traviss, and Troy Denning, this 9-book mega-series followed up New Jedi Order and Dark Nest by sending Jason Solo to the dark side. These 9 covers were all done by Jason Felix, and there's a distinct consistency between them all that wasn't present for the last mega-series, NJO. Each cover had 1 or sometimes 2 characters on it, painted with an emphasis on a single color, to give each book a cleaner and more monochromatic look that I was referencing earlier, often tied to the lightsaber color present. Sacrifice is a good example of this style, with a detailed background behind an also very detailed Mara Jade, stylishly facing the reader. Fury features Ben Skywalker, Luke and Mara's son, and seems to use Mark Hamill's face as a heavy reference, logically. Though my favorite of the bunch has to be Revelation, with Darkside Jason fully depicted with a red saber and a battle going on behind him. I just think it's really cool. During this time, Struzan also returned for the cover of The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, and frequent and popular comic cover artist Hugh Fleming came on board for The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Right after Legacy of the Force ended, though, some of the best Star Wars covers ever were released with the Coruscant Nights trilogy by Michael Reeves. Appearing noir-esque in visual style, and with the absolute skill of Glenn Orbick behind the paintbrush, I absolutely adore these covers. They feel like Dorman, Struzan, or Fleming pieces, but with more dimensionality to them, getting much more creative with the framing, angles, and especially color. Street of Shadows in particular is absolutely gorgeous, and it definitely fits into my Hall of Fame of Star Wars book covers. In 2008, The Clone Wars and The Force Unleashed both got novelizations, with reused works for their covers, unfortunately, and then came some tie-in books for The Clone Wars over the next few years, with books like Wild Space and No Prisoners having minimal cover art again that used lots of pre-developed assets from the show. John Van Fleet returned again for a somewhat laughable Millennium Falcon cover. It just feels like a rookie Photoshop project. And Randy Martinez handled the fun little illustrations on the bottoms of the Rebel Force covers. Also in 2008, Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor came out, with a stunning cover art once again from Dave Seeley, making him one of the most underrated artists of the Star Wars book universe. The late 2000s got a little weird with all the Clone Wars tie-ins, like the Clone Wars Gambit duology with art by Craig Howell, but I do like this cover art. These are some really interesting pieces, and feel like they belong a little earlier in the decade than 2010. 2009 gave us Death Troopers, with Indica's iconic bloody cover for the spooky novel, its simplicity reflecting the time's changing preferred graphic design style. Clone Wars Secret Missions books 1 through 4 also began here, with some really great cover art by Wayne Lowe for this Young Readers series that was emblematic of the type of art we'd see in Young Readers books in years to come. I mean, there's a lot of character here, and the compositions are all compelling and fun. Adventures in hyperspace came and went during this period too, with Robert Rath's cover art being nothing to write home about, but still fun for a Scholastic book. In 2010, Dave Seeley returned for Crosscurrent, and between 2009 and 2011, we were introduced to the next mega series, Fate of the Jedi, following the formula laid out by Legacy of the Force shortly after. 9 books, identical cover layouts with a prominent single color, and 1, maybe 2 characters on each cover, each illustrated by Ian Kelty. The art here, however, is not painted, but is instead this very early 2010s posterized imagery of character art over a very simplistic background, with a continuous motif of the Coruscant skyline framing it all. These covers are good. The face photoshopping was pretty obvious in several cases, and these covers interestingly seem more dated than the Legacy of the Force ones because of how much they remind me of this era of design. They're cool, consistent, and stick out on any shelf, but I don't think they look serious enough for the story they tell. But I can appreciate this era's design tendencies. 2011 also gave us our last taste of Dave Seeley's work, with the close-up Riptide cover. Concurrently, the Old Republic books began, with Fatal Alliance, Deceived, and Revan having incredibly detailed and epic cover art from Attic and Merrick Okan. This feels very much like the good stuff from the early 2010s, with clearly digital but very realistic art gracing the cover of each book. I'm a fan of these pieces. At the same time, we got more era-specific stuff like Red Harvest, the prequel to Death Troopers with a very similarly styled cover, coming from the same artist, Indica, and a similar paperback cover as well. And we got Shadow Games by Reeves and Bonoff as our first appearance of Scott Beale's work. And yes, our old friend John Van Fleet returned for 2 more with the covers of Knight Errant and Choices of One, both feeling a little dated, with Choices of One's misshapen stormtroopers reappearing from Van Fleet's earlier Allegiance cover. Interestingly though, Choices of One actually has a separate paperback cover as well, and this one is gorgeous, with this captivating piece by Daryl Mandrick. Luckily, these 3D models weren't as common, with Torstein Nordstrand's incredible painting covering the legendary Darth Plagueis by James Luceno. The shadows and simplicity here make it immediately interesting, and the way Nordstrand plays with scale just makes it all so much more thematically relevant. Such a gorgeous cover. Then Scourge by Jeff Grubb came and went with a fascinatingly simple and uncommon photograph cover by Larry Rostand, perfectly resembling 2012 design sensibilities. 2012 also saw the last hurrah of the X-Wing series, with Mercy Kill, set near the end of the timeline, having cover art unfortunately from someone other than Paul Ewell, like earlier entries, especially considering what happened less than a year later, but we'll get to that soon. Mike Bryan's cover art isn't bad though, it just doesn't visually match the rest of the series at all, and it definitely fits the early 2010s in terms of design sensibility for sci-fi books that lean more military. Separated from the earlier X-Wing books, I actually do kind of like the iconography involved in this cover too. In 2012, Lucasfilm was sold to Disney, and therefore a lot of things were changing behind the scenes in preparation for the introduction of a new book canon, in which on-screen projects would live as well. Due to this, from 2012 to 2014, the Still Legends book publishing slowed down immensely, with the production pipeline clearing itself out, and not much else. Zahn's final novel, Scoundrels, brought back an old name, as I referenced earlier, with Paul Ewell returning with a more person-focused piece covering the novel, and Gene Malika's digital painting covering The Last Jedi's cover, not the movie. We also got one final Old Republic book with Annihilation by Drew Karpyshyn, which doesn't actually have a credited cover artist, likely meaning the art just came from the game or from LucasArts. Torstein Nordstrand of Plagueis fame returned for Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void, gracing us with yet another fascinating layout that immediately grabs the eye, especially the Tho-Yor, unlike pretty much any other Star Wars book cover. And of course, who else but Cliff Nielsen is back, giving us once more digitally aged up Han, Luke, and Leia on the cover of the furthest book in the timeline, Crucible by Troy Denning. It's kind of poetic having both Ewell and Nielsen back for this final chapter of the old EU. One artist from one period and another from another distinct period coming back to celebrate the end of this timeline. Though I have to say, Crucible actually did have a preliminary cover that I like more than the final version. The final version was actually cropped from this other version, and I think the full scene looks a little better. But still, it's all Nielsen. Closing things out, Chris McGrath gave us a mythical, textured, and mysterious desert-like cover for Kenobi by John Jackson Miller, its tattered nature feeling right in line with the book's topic. Steve Stone gave us this simplistic yet 2000s-like, awkward photoshoppy cover for Martha Wells' Razor's Edge, definitely feeling very 2010s in its design. And a similar cover came later with Alan Brooks's cover for James S.A. Corey's Honor Among Thieves, very simply combining promo photography with an empty background. I don't know what it is about these two covers, but they really reflect to me what Lucasfilm was trying to do during this time to revitalize the brand. Revisit the original trilogy era, strip everything down, and somewhat start over with familiar iconography from A New Hope, which is ironic considering that's what happened later that year with the new canon. And finally, second to last before Honor Among Thieves, was Joe Schreiber's final book, Maul Lockdown, one of the edgiest book covers ever. Darth Maul is shirtless, chained up, and done in Scott Beale's textured, painting on cement style, faded, tattered, and quite frankly, awesome. The photoshopped hands always get me though. In September 2015, A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller released. The first book of the new canon, this one's cover by Douglas Wheatley brought back a painted style similar to Torstein Nordstrand's work, with a return to the Imperial era with new characters. The title and cover of this book feel so prominent and intentional to me for this being a new canon. New characters, a new dawn, hope on the horizon. The early new canon was very much in this scope for its first few books, with Lucino's Tarkin coming shortly after, with Jim Moore's painted cover reflecting the new single-character focused book we'd begin seeing during this time. Heir to the Jedi also came and went during this time with another cover by Larry Rostand, who was behind the Scourge cover, and you can kind of feel this. Luke's body feels a bit live action here, and this is repurposed art for his face. Tarkin and Heir to the Jedi are a little special on their own, given that they were written for the old canon. Heir specifically being the third book in an original trilogy Heroes trilogy with Razor's Edge and Honor Among Thieves, just winding up in the new canon instead. And you can feel that as well. The cover feels like late period Legends. During this period, Jason Fry's legendary Servants of the Empire series began as well, a tie-in to Star Wars Rebels that had covers that were an odd mix of assets from the show mixed with digital paintings. Jean-Paul Balmet's Edge of the Galaxy cover sticking out to me as practically Imperial propaganda, fitting for the series' Academy focus. Meanwhile, Imperial Justice is much more clearly illustrated by David Lemerrier, while Jim Moore's art for books 2 and 4 makes for a fun collection. After the 3D modeled cover of Lords of the Sith by Aaron McBride, and Matt Taylor's roughly painted silhouette-focused Dark Disciple cover, which reflect, in that order, the last of the old ways of modeling covers, which we'd also see later that year on the Battlefront tie-in Twilight Company, also by McBride, and the beginning of a new, more stylized type cover, we would receive Lost Stars, a simplistic, graphic cover for the first young adult Star Wars book of the modern era, where YA books are more popular and even read by older audiences. Pilot Studios' cover evokes emptiness, but also a dichotomy, actually depicting a scene from near the end of the book, but from very far away. This was really unprecedented for Star Wars book covers, fitting for Claudia Gray's unique and incredible first contribution to the world of Star Wars. And it wasn't just this time. Soon after, YA retellings of the original trilogy released, with incredibly simplistic cover art by Koa Ho that fully launched us into the mid-2010s language of simple design that would prominently continue even into the 2020s, with the simple and obviously text-heavy covers of the From a Certain Point of View series, all three being minimalist designs by Will Stahl. This was also the beginning of The Road to the Force Awakens, an initiative that gave us renowned comic artist Phil Noto's first contribution to the Star Wars universe, with covers and interior illustrations for Smuggler's Run, Weapon of a Jedi, Moving Target, and Before the Awakening. All black, white, and red, these distinctly lined and painted covers are very stylized, incorporating either iconography or blocks of color in the background that really make the grayscale heroes pop. The road to TFA also gave us Aftermath, a book about the weeks immediately following the Battle of Endor. And you can tell. This cover breaks some standard rules for Star Wars and once again omits a character from its cover, by Scott Beale once again. We can see his signature splatters and blur, and I think that really works here. A huge emphasis on the prominent connotation of the word Aftermath, right under the exploding Death Star 2, makes it clear what this book is going to be about. The Force Awakens novelization was unfortunately just the film's poster, and after that, Adventures in Wild Space began. These young readers' books have some great covers, done in a modern illustration style that actually really appeals to me. Distinct colors, fun character designs, and a great theme of kids on the bottom with several villain characters on top. I like David M. Buisson's work here. In mid-2016, Scott Beale returned once more for Bloodline and Aftermath Life Debt, two books that eagerly continued his common trends in design. Cement and splatter-like rough textures, looming shapes, distinct colors, great text design, silhouettes, and some serious negative space. Soon after, Wojtek Fuse's Ahsoka cover brought another painted one to the table, with, again, a single character focus and lots of negative space. Rogue One's novelization was another poster, and Beale's Aftermath Empire's End continued all of his trends, maybe to the max, with the looming, falling Star Destroyer actually covering the Star Wars logo, something not commonly seen. Acker and Blacker's Join the Resistance had covers by Annie Wu, which are consistently fun and very much of that era's schoolbook doodle style, with simple characters done in a somewhat flat but very cartoony 2D style. The studio Two Dots provided the covers for the first canon Thrawn trilogy, with highly detailed, figure-focused covers with, again, lots of negative space. Two Dots also notably provided cover art for the Brazilian versions of several Star Wars books, including A New Dawn, Darth Plagueis, and Heir to the Jedi. And I just think these are incredible. In the same vein, Rebel Rising had a painted cover by Brian Rood, with more interesting uses of negative space, incorporating elements of the Imperial lighting techniques seen in the original trilogy. Guardians of the Whills by Greg Rucka had an incredible cover by Diogo Saito with a more setting-based painting, while a thematically similar yet differently styled work by Two Dots adorned Christy Golden's Inferno Squad. Figure-based and lots of negative space, kinda like a painted version of Scott Beale's work, but still, as with everything from Two Dots, very detailed. Soon after, Leia, Princess of Alderaan released, with those two attributes dialed up to 11, with blank white negative space surrounding Leia gorgeously painted by Daniel Bowling Walsh, with a band of Alderaan behind her in deep red, befitting of The Last Jedi's theming, which this book and the next few were released under. This was the Journey to the Last Jedi. Phasma, as I said, also fits these colors, and Larry Rostin's Photoshoppy style feels more proper than ever here, giving us a cold, close-up look at Phasma's helmet in the dark. It's just beautiful, and feels like Rostin's style at its absolute best. I'm glad they kept him around and finally gave him a cover that he could absolutely excel at. The Legends of Luke Skywalker brings us back to Luke, with a cover and interior paintings by J.G. Jones that celebrate the legacy of Luke Skywalker across the saga, in preparation for his long-awaited return in TLJ. A fully colored version of this cover art is available later in the book too, though I understand the color change for branding purposes. Canto Bight brings back Dark Disciples' Matt Taylor for another stylish cover involving lines, silhouettes, and limited color schemes, adding in some gold to counterbalance the black and white and red of TLJ's theming, while adding in some promo photo posterized characters in the bottom to represent the book's varied cast. And just like with TFA, TLJ got a Phil Noto covered young reader's book in Cobalt Squadron, with Rose, Paige, and Nix adorning this great book cover. I love the layout here and how it incorporates the more mechanical and round imagery associated with the bombers. TLJ's novelization is a poster, and the next book, Last Shot, a solo tie-in, brought back Scott Beale, and once again, you can tell. The interesting thing about this one is that the hardcover had interchangeable covers for a Han and Lando version, while the paperback was split between the two, providing some great variety. There was even a special edition version featuring L3 and Chewbacca. Speaking of which, the mighty Chewbacca in the Forest of Fear brought in Andy Tong to give us a fun, cartoony cover. And Most Wanted went full in on the painted style, with Florian Nicolet's head and shoulders focused rendering of Han and Kira on Corellia. I like the stylization and brushstrokes here. Solo's novelization, another poster, and Lando's Luck and Pirate's Price bringing back Annie Wu for more sketch-like covers on these fun books. Meanwhile, Elsa Chartier's similar style adorned the Choose Your Destiny books, which released in the late 2010s. And I like these ones. I think they fit the style of the era, have some fun energy, and make sense for the age group. I've always loved the energy on the Finn and Poe one. Paintings were back big time though, with the gorgeous and more impressionist style for Alice X. Zhang's incredible cover for Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray, and the more focused and realistic covers by Tara Phillips for the Queen's Trilogy by E.K. Johnston. The lighting in particular in the Queen's Trilogy is absolutely incredible, and I like the prominence of the brushstrokes if you look close enough, but from far away it looks pretty photorealistic. All 4 of these books receiving alternate covers that expand on their style with a special edition and different formats respectively. I really like how Phillips' work on the Queen's Trilogy decided to pull things back and show us a wider scene for the special editions. Meanwhile, Galaxy's Edge Black Spire gave us this great painted scene by Darren Tahn, plus the slightly altered paperback cover. And the other Galaxy's Edge book, A Crash of Fate, showed us yet another scene painted by Matt Griffin. A Crash of Fate has always stood out to me. The color scheme almost leaning in the pink and purple direction while representing nature feels very hazy and mythical to me, and I like it a lot. Very stylistic choice for a cover as well, avoiding a prominent character. The Alphabet Squadron trilogy also began during this time, giving us some more negative space heavy and single figure focused covers, with a posterized style and this wonderful triangular motif on all 3, each with a distinct color scheme yet being tied together by their similar elements. All of this done and arranged by Jeff Langevin. Aaron McBride's Dooku Jedi Lost script book and audio cover is gorgeously done, with an emphasis on diagonals and negative space again, while Force Collector by Tony Foti leaned into more realism, though still maintaining a YA cartoonishness. I feel like this one goes under the radar a lot. And once again, Phil Noto reprised his role as sequel tie-in cover illustrator for Spark of the Resistance, fitting the same color scheme but featuring one character this time, and making this a nice little unofficial trilogy. Resistance Reborn came soon after, with Scott Woolston's cover art feeling like a more Photoshop-heavy version of the classic Struzan art, something I really like. I mean, look at it compared to Planet of Twilight. The Rise of Skywalker's novelization cover was, I don't even have to say it at this point. Alex Segura's Poe Dameron Freefall brought Phil Noto back once again for a more distinct, yet just as negative space heavy cover, but I do like the patterns in the background, and the small floating elements in the front have always stood out to me. We also got a script book for the Dr. Aphra audio drama, featuring a really fun and well-colored cover by Kevin Tong. After this, some of the most unique cover art for Star Wars was released, with the Ascendancy trilogy by Timothy Zahn. These covers by Swarovski Design are hyper simplistic, with an emphasis on the textures on the bottom of the Chimera from Rebels, and the small monochromatic figure of Thrawn on each cover. These are such a departure from the common look for Star Wars books, but I honestly appreciate them as they really feel like Star Wars books for the modern age, which is especially cool considering the author is the longest continuous author for the franchise. Seriously, these are really hip covers. And while I don't love them personally, I think they reflect a good direction for the franchise to go in. But along with all that history and prominence, something huge was on the horizon. In early 2021, the High Republic began, Canon's first true multimedia publishing initiative. Like Shadows of the Empire, but 10 times bigger. Over the past few years, this has resulted in many novels as of the release of this video, spanning all the age brackets of readers under the Star Wars banner. This began with Light of the Jedi, with a wonderful cover by Joseph Meehan, introducing a photorealistic style that would follow into the next book, The Rising Storm, with a distinctly darker cover. yet still focused on Jedi characters at the forefront. The lighting on the Rising Storm has always stood out to me. Meanwhile, the junior novels of the first wave of the initiative were done by Peter Antonson, offering a more cartoonish style into the time period, fitting for the age group, yet still maintaining Phase 1's bright stylings to all three junior novels of the era. The third age group, the young adult novels, began with what I consider to be one of the most interesting covers, Into the Dark. It has a painted, very stylized cover by Giorgio Baroni. This was unfortunately the only cover we ever got in this interesting style, with some seriously cool framing, as the next two YA novels had covers that were also great but not as stylized, with art by Grzegorz Krasinski. I love Midnight Horizon's cover. And for the third adult novel, Yi-Jung Lee helmed Claudia Gray's The Fallen Star, shifting the style but keeping with the scope and framing of the last two. I specifically like the background for this one, something that the first two books might have been lacking, despite their photorealistic and gorgeous Jedi renderings. Along with Phase 1 came an audio drama script book for Tempest Runner by Cavan Scott, Katerina Belikova giving us another wonderful rendering of Lorna D in the digital painting style. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Jama Jurabayev's out-of-print special edition covers for the three adult novels of Phase 1. These are some of the most incredible book covers that I've ever seen for Star Wars and evoke a vibe like pretty much nothing else. The Rising Storm's Valo Fair cover being incredibly close to my heart as one of the most beautiful Star Wars covers I have ever seen. During and after Phase 1 of the High Republic, other books released too, like Ronin by Emma Mieko Kandon, the Visions novel with an incredible Japanese-inspired cover by Kotaro Chiba. We also saw Mike Chen's Brotherhood, which, taking place in the first month or so of the Clone Wars, appropriated some of that publishing era's cover art techniques, something I'm a huge fan of. The cover, by Laura Rosero, heavily uses promo imagery, similar to covers like The Approaching Storm, but with the more negative space we're used to in modern covers. I really like the circular background behind them too. Padawan by Kirsten White came soon after this, with a fully painted close-up cover, with a nice misty background by Charlie Bowater. Similar to Brotherhood, Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher takes place in the New Republic era, and its cover by Juan Esteban R. properly appropriates a bit of Struzan-like 90s design cues for the subject matter, only in a completely different digital style, and a totally different design language for title formatting and spacing. And of course, more negative space, leading to a totally different cover layout that makes it feel fresh, but still rooted in the classics. But if we're talking Struzan appropriation, I don't think any artist has gotten closer to his aesthetic in the modern era than Oliver Cuthbertson's gorgeous cover for The Princess and the Scoundrel. The backlighting, the angular yet line-heavy strokes, and even the signature little stormtroopers. I absolutely adore this cover, and it's definitely in my top 10 for the modern age. Phase 2 of the High Republic began in late 2022 with Path of Deceit. The YA novels Path of Deceit and Path of Deception had these interesting, large, scenic illustrations by Corey Brickley, emphasizing the scale of the story being told. Convergence and Cataclysm went the opposite directions, with awesome painted covers with stylized backdrops behind lightsaber-wielding characters, with great color usage and angles, once again by Yi-Jung Lee. Nyla Magruder was brought in for the cover of Quest for the Hidden City, giving us this fun action scene cover well summarizing the book's plot. But Peter Antonson was back for the next junior novel with Quest for Planet X. And in the middle of it all, the only thing in Phase 2 that wasn't a 2 was the audio drama Battle of Jedha, with an incredible cover by Grant Griffin, taking cues from Cataclysm and Convergence in its white background and paint strokes, as Griffin beautifully renders the Jedi fading into the red at their legs and somewhat blending into the background. It just feels historic and momentous to me. During, but not connected to Phase 2, came Jedi Battle Scars by Sam Maggs, with a posterized collection of Fallen Order promo art making up the bottom half of the cover by Anthrax Studio, while on top, the fifth brother appears in his Rebels cartoon stylings, despite this taking place well after a live-action depiction of the character had been created for Obi-Wan. We also saw Hunters Battle for the Arena, with a fun, cartoony cover once again by Andy Tong, and Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade by Delilah S. Dawson. Anthony Jones gave Inquisitor its cover, once again focusing on diagonals, showing Iskat Ikaris in a stylized, painted form, standing in front of the Star Wars logo. This one feels very trendy and modern to me. And even though I'm not talking about every alt cover, I really do have to mention Inquisitor's one. The Comic-Con exclusive version is just beautiful, by Grant Griffin again. Crimson Climb arrived just before the High Republic Phase 3, with this simple, posterized depiction of Kira by Julian D. Paulson in front of a weathered beige backdrop. This might be the biggest example of purely digital covers not working the best for books in the modern era. Soon after that, though, Grant Griffin returned from Jeddah to give us the first two incredibly detailed and gorgeously framed adult book covers for Phase 3 of the High Republic. Peter Antonson returned for his same styled junior covers, but this time with a lot more color, particularly on Escape from Valo, and Corey Brickley giving us some incredible work for the YA covers. The color usage, particularly on Beware the Nameless, is really just incredible. Seriously, that green is amazing. And earlier this year, 2024, we also got the return of Oliver Cuthbertson for the gorgeous cover of The Living Force, intended to reflect Struzan's poster art for the prequel trilogy and accomplishing that handsomely. After that, as of the making of this video, we only know of 2 other books coming down the pipeline, and both reflect modern design cues perfectly. Steve Barnes' upcoming Mace Windu The Glass Abyss has a beautiful painted cover by Oliver Barrett, mixing negative space, an iconic character, and popular Star Wars iconography into one image. Not unlike Scott Beale's work, mixed with Oliver Cuthbertson's style of painting. I like this one. And then in 2025, we know we're at least getting Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed, with art by Marko Manev, and its cover features a tiny Mon Mothma in a large, dark, shadowy Senate. This feels a lot like Corey Brickley's work in Path of Deceit, with a lot of negative space occupied by text, and a solitary figure in the middle, not unlike Swarovski Design's Ascendancy work. Count me as excited. And that brings us to today. We've come a long way together, and we've changed a lot. From the simple, beautiful painted covers of the original 70s and early 80s, into the more excessive, full, bright painted covers of the 90s. Into the dawn of the digital age and all of the new artistic abilities it gave us. Through the late 2000s edgy periods, growing consistency and popularity of 2010's internet-style simplistic artsy covers. And back into the era of recalling covers of the past in the 2020s, all while pushing the boundaries in new ways by continuing to use modern stylings in inventive fashions. Following the trends of the industry while breaking new ground for Star Wars book cover art. Because they're not just book covers. They are what grabs the imagination. For many, they are reference images for non-visual stories, giving a visible dimension to these narratives. And that's why I think they're important. Star Wars' book covers contain a lot of people's hard work in visualizing aspects of prose in various ways. And that's why you've noticed me say as many artists' names in this video as I can, because I think they don't get nearly enough credit. Yes, we all know Drew Struzan and Dave Dorman, but some other artists were just as, if not more prolific in the amount of work they contributed to the Star Wars galaxy. Whether their art be digital or physical, simplistic or detailed, full of negative space or of background, they deserve to be spoken about. Even if they had one outing, like Alice X. Zhang's Master and Apprentice cover, or Daniel Bowling Walsh's amazing Princess of Alderaan cover. Or many, like Cliff Nielsen's 27 covers or Steve Chorney's charmingly spooky Galaxy of Fear work. It's all so special, to me and I think to a lot of other people. And every single one of these artists' work deserves to be appreciated as part of the vast Star Wars galaxy. Now, as a special little treat, I'm going to include a top 10 list of my favorite Star Wars book covers ever released. This is a tough one, and I challenge you to go through the video and pick out your favorites too, so you can experience just how tough this is and make your list as well. It was especially hard for me to not include a ton of Struzan work, as you can tell that I like his stuff. But here we go. Our honorable mention is MedStar 1 Battle Surgeons by Dave Seeley. The composition is fun and raw, with Barris's lightsaber plunging through the super battle droid in a beautifully painted way. This cover just absolutely encompasses the Clone Wars to me, and Seeley's wonderful work. I'll never dislike the MedStar duology's cover art. At number 10, we have Force Heretic Remnant. John Foster is legendary, and his depiction of Luke and Mara here is spectacular. Their pose is unorthodox, and the flowing strokes of Foster's style creating a cement-like frame around a green background, matching Luke's saber held low as blasters are raised in front of a screaming Yuuzhan Vong face. It's abstract yet depicts a wonderful scene in a way that only John Foster can. Number 9 is The Princess and the Scoundrels cover by Oliver Cuthbertson, as it feels like a celebration of Drew Struzan's work in the history of Star Wars books. The composition here is so delightful, and so is the lighting behind Han and Leia, and also from below, with the bluish-green glow bleeding into their negative space-backed embrace. The ice castle is so charming, and the Ewok village blending into it is just beautiful. I love the color scheme of this cover. And then at number 8 is Scott Beale's Aftermath. It seems like I'm biased to painted covers, and I probably am, but this one breaks the mold for me in how it works its text design into the cover. I haven't talked about the text too much, but as a major font and graphic design nerd, I'm really passionate about the text design on Star Wars books, and that's why, by the way, in my videos I only use fonts that were officially used by Star Wars books in the 90s. But for Aftermath, it's so bright. It's misty, and it communicates its ideas with a single word alone combined with a single iconic image. It's got a great color scheme and just works for me really well. This is the aftermath of the destruction of the Death Star 2. Number 7 is Coruscant Nights 2: Street of Shadows by Glenn Orbick. Pure pulp of Star Wars is contained in Orbick's work here. The shattered backdrop containing repeated faces. The green front-lit figures outlined in red glow from their blaster bolts. This is noir in Star Wars at its absolute height, and I'll never get over just how wonderful this layout is and how good the lighting is here. Number 6 offers us the Crystal Star. Luke Skywalker front and center, integrating the swirling backgrounds Drew is known for into the cover in a meaningful way. Chewie, Han, and Leia molded into Luke's semi-silhouette with an eerie and beautiful purplish glow across the whole thing. Backlighting at its finest, this cover screams ominous fantasy to me. Junior Jedi Knights: Kenobi's Blade is number 5 for me. It's cool. As a children's book, this is just gorgeous too. Cartoonish yet realistic figures, beams of light and smoke, and the absolutely electric energy beaming out of this foreground figure after a lightsaber slash. It's just really, really well done. I would have wanted to read this as a kid. Number 4 takes us all the way back to 482 BBY with the Battle of Jedha cover by Grant Griffin. Colors galore here. I love how Griffin realizes these figures. The prominent, messy-looking painted style with speckles of paint in the background and coming off of highlights and shadows is very fun. It feels epic, it feels medieval, and it encompasses the Jedi of the High Republic for me in a perfect way. These are Jedi as knights. They're defending a city. The loose background of Jedha feels right in line with this and the era and concept as well. All framed as dusty paint strokes over a white background, this cover has my heart. Number 3 has to be X-Wing Iron Fist. This cover feels straight out of the original trilogy, but maybe even better. Like a beautiful, lightened film scan from some unknown scene in Return of the Jedi. But it's not that. It's Paul Ewell's incredible skill. I love the looming moons, the bright explosions, and blasts not being the focus but the highlight. And of course how skillfully Ewell uses these highlights to place shadows or glow on the ties in the foreground. For me, this is the epitome of Starfighter book covers. Number 2 brings us back to the Yuuzhan Vong War with John Harris's cover of Dark Tide Onslaught. This cover, as I discussed previously, is pure vibes. Nothing better represents the incredible threat of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion force than this cover. X-Wings iconically standing on a plane. A small, stylized pilot running to an empty cockpit, with a perfect, confusingly shaped mass looming with coral-like extensions on it. X-Wings flying off to accept its obvious visual challenge. This cover tells a story, shows us a call to action, and does it in the expertly visual way that Star Wars has been doing from the very beginning. And at number 1, with no surprise, is what I mentioned earlier, Planet of Twilight. What do I even need to say? Struzan at arguably his best, with Vision of the Future being this cover's only competition in my opinion. Leia, Han, and Luke not looking traced, but making a diamond-shaped frame with a Rebel Alliance turret and group of soldiers on the right. Leia's lightsaber framing the book's edge. Misty, swirling clouds outlining everything. The lighting on the edge of Leia's face. The monochromatic yet distinct shadows of it all. I can't begin to tell you how much this cover art represents the best of Star Wars to me. In a similar way to how Onslaught's cover inspires the war aspect of Star Wars in me and the scope, Planet of Twilight's cover stirs in me the love for these characters I have always felt. It's just perfect. It's gold for a reason. And I like the book too. Thank you all so much for watching. If you made it all the way to here, I'm glad you're here. This clearly means a lot to me. I mean, look at that runtime. And if you're looking to hear more about what I really care about in Star Wars in a way that centralizes it all under one big wonderful galaxy, I'd implore you to subscribe. But also, please tell me your top 10 Star Wars book covers using this video. Scrub through, pick your favorites, and tell me why they inspire you. Tell me why they mean a lot to you or hold a special place in your heart. I'd love to hear what you think. Once again, thank you so much for joining me on this journey.